Well, hello, buddy. My name's Nate, if we haven't met, and it's an honor to be together. And I want to say hello to everybody who's watching or listening, different place, different time. So one thing I just want to highlight, Irving, who just led us in our prayer time, Irving is completing 18 months of a church planting residency. And in September, Irving and his wife Monique will be planting a Spanish-speaking church here in Billings. And I just love that. I'm so proud of them. Great young couple. Ooh, not fun. So we've been walking through the book of Matthew. There are 4 books that chronicle the life of Jesus, written by 4 different disciples. And they seem to have written these books later in their life. I think everybody had the expectation that Jesus could come back at any moment. But as these men aged, they realized that they've been able to speak the story of Jesus and repeat the teachings of Jesus verbally for their whole lives. But as they looked at their own potential physical demise, they took the time to write down these 4 accounts of the life of Jesus. And we're looking at Matthew. And we've walked through the book. Matthew is just brilliant. He's this guy that used to work for the Roman government as a tax collector. And Jesus calls him away. He's probably really well educated. The way he writes it signifies that he had a really significant education in his background. And he's presented Jesus as the king. And then the whole middle of the book, Jesus as a prophet. And then just last week in Matthew chapter 14, he does something for the first time, and Jesus reveals that he is indeed God. And this happens in a storm as they're crossing a boat, and his disciples worship him. They'd always admired him. They'd always listened to him. But something transpires when Jesus says, "It is I," ego eimi in Greek, "do not be afraid." They realize we're not dealing with a man anymore. And from that point on to the rest of the book, and we'll be studying this book up through Easter weekend, it's this beautiful portrait of Jesus as God. And here's where we're going to be today, is Matthew chapter 16. And before we jump into it, we're going to need to do a little bit of cultural and geography background, because I would say, as much as any passage I know of in the New Testament, how you understand these verses is really dependent on understanding where this happens and the geography that surrounds it, okay? So, listen, for years I read the scriptures and didn't know this, and I still read Matthew chapter 16 and got things out of it. There's plenty of things you can get out of it. But to understand the fullness of what Jesus is saying, you ready? It's going to be a little bit of history, a little bit of geography, but I promise you it's going to pay off in the end. Okay, where is this taking place? Little town called Caesarea Philippi. Today it's little. In the first century, it was not little. It was the eventual capital of Herod Philip. He built his entire kingdom, and his administration was housed there. And it is at the base of Mount Hermon. Let me show you a picture of Mount Hermon. When you think of Israel, typically you kind of think of a desert region, but in the very northern part of Israel is this mountain called Mount Hermon. And that is a picture of it. It's over 9,000 feet, so it rivals a lot of the mountains that we have here in Montana or wherever you're at. In fact, there's a ski area on top of Mount Hermon. But you just don't kind of think of it Israeli skiing. Now, it's no big sky. It's a ski area with like 2 little lifts, and you kind of like find the snow. But it's a big mountain. And here's what's particular about Mount Hermon. The rock there is incredibly porous. So the warm Mediterranean air hits the cold air, and it gets significant moisture in snow and rain. And here's what happens on Mount Hermon. Rather than having multiple streams that come down from these snowfields, the water soaks directly into the rock and emerges here at the bottom. And what we're about to read takes place right here at the bottom in this city called Caesarea Philippi. So here's the history of Caesarea Philippi. The Canaanites. So these ancient people you can read of in the Old Testament, kind of the arch nemesis of the Jewish people, had been worshiping in Caesarea Philippi for centuries. They called it Baal. In fact, they gave it 3 different names. They believed that their god Baal would live or at least visit the top of Mount Hermon. And so here's where they worship Baal, and they called it Baal Gad and Baal Hermon. It's found in Joshua chapter 1, Judges chapter 3, 1 Chronicles chapter 5. And their god, Baal, was a fertility god. And they sought him every single spring because they believed that he lived under the earth within hell. And he emerged from under the earth if you pleased him by bringing enough sacrifices. Typically for them it was sheep. You would sacrifice these sheep, Baal would emerge, and with him would come spring. So this has been happening for centuries, worshiping this foreign god. 332 BC, guess who comes along? Alexander the Great. And as he passes by, his men see this ancient temple to the god Baal, and in typical Greek fashion, they rename it and rededicate it to their god, Pan. So Pan is one of the Greek pantheon of gods. Let me show you a picture of him. It's very difficult to find an appropriate picture of Pan because he is a god of fertility. He's a god of the forest. He is a god of the shepherds and herdsmen. He's a trickster god, but here's the most appropriate picture of Pan I could find. He's half man, and then he is half goat. And Pan played a big part in Greek mythology and worship. Pan was this god of perpetual youth. He's very playful. He plays the flute, and he's the god of the forest. We get our word panic from him. So he had the ability to frighten people significantly in the night and in the forest. That's where we get our word panic. Matter of fact, Peter Pan, the perpetual youth, named after the god Pan. So Pan crawled under the earth in the winter, just like Baal. And every spring, the Greeks would come and they would sacrifice enormous numbers of goats to Pan, asking for spring to come back, asking for Pan to come and bring his blessing. So Alexander the Great's men renamed this city that was Baal Gad to Paneas. So it's to their god Pan. So for 332 years, people have been worshiping Pan on this location. Phase 3, okay? So you've got worshiping Baal, worshiping Pan. Phase 3, Herod the Great decides, hey, we should build another temple, and we should build this temple to the Roman gods. And so he builds a temple to Zeus on the same location, and then he builds a temple to this new cult of the emperor. So he builds the temple to worship the Caesar of Rome. Now, all of this was destroyed during the Ottoman Empire, but here's a picture of what these temples would have looked like. So this is Caesarea Philippi. You have a temple to Pan. You have a temple to Zeus. You have a temple to Caesar. And they're all located right here. So this is the northernmost part of Israel. This is like where a good Jewish boy never went. Okay? This is like where Judaism and paganism collide. And I want you to think for a moment, for thousands of years, people have been coming here to appease the gods, to offer sacrifices. Daily, there would have been sacrifices to Caesar because Caesar has declared himself to be divine. There would have been daily sacrifices to Zeus and to Pan, and even some would sacrifice still to this ancient god Baal. And Jesus takes his disciples there. I want to show you one more picture. This is why this has been a hotbed for all this varied religious expression. It's this hole. So remember, Mount Hermon is up above. And as all that water filters through, there's this enormous cavern. This is actually real human. This was taken while I was there. This is a real human. It's massive. And you could go to the edge of it, and the springs would actually flow out. This is the headwaters of the Jordan River. And people would take rocks, and you could throw a rock in, and you'd never hear it hit the water in the bottom. And so here's what the Canaanites, the Greeks, and those in the first century believed. They believed this was the entrance to the gates of hell, the gates of Hades. So this is why they have been building for thousands of years all these different places of worship. Because Hades was this murky, dark underworld that was indiscernible. It was where gods would retreat when they were angry at you. And these are the remnants of all these temples. This is how it looks today. So here they are, standing in front of the gates of hell. And if you know that, what we're about to read will help us determine what exactly Jesus is saying. Matthew chapter 16, we'll start at verse 13. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, so it had been Baal Gad, and then it was Paneas, and now Philip was given this city for his 16th birthday present, and he calls it Caesarea after Caesar and then after himself. So his new name is Caesarea Philippi. He asked his disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" Now, pause there for just a moment, because this Son of Man is a very interesting phrase. Jesus is actually giving them a clue when he asks the question. This Son of Man comes from Daniel chapter 7, which was something written centuries before. And it's a prophecy from the book of Daniel. I'd love for you to read that on your own. It's Daniel chapter 7, verse 13 through 14, where Daniel has a vision of someone who is going to come one day, whose kingdom will be everlasting. And it's this vision of who Jesus would be and what he would fulfill, okay? So who do people say that the Son of Man is? Well, they replied. Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others Jeremiah, or one of the prophets. Then Jesus changes the question, and he asks what I believe is the most important question that any human being will ever have to answer. It is the question. But what about you, he asked. Who do you say I am? Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah." Hebrew, Mashiach. It's the promised one, the anointed one, the one that Hebrew people have been praying for twice a day from the very beginning. The Son of the living God. Definite article before each one. This is this bold statement. And Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven." I want to pause here for a moment. So there are some of us who are listening here in the room, and we call it you're spiritually unresolved. You're asking great questions. And we're highly encourage that. Scrutinize the teachings of Jesus. Ask great questions. Here's something interesting that Jesus says. When Peter makes this statement, Simon Peter says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Here's Jesus' response. You didn't get there by yourself. There is an interesting element to the spiritual journey of deciding who Jesus is, where it's not all about my own mind, my own cognizance, my own intelligence. That God reveals who he is to people. So please, ask your questions, scrutinize the teachings of Jesus, but here's the issue. Anybody who's been following Jesus more than 10 years, I'm going to ask you, if all of your questions about Jesus and God and spiritual life have been answered, raise your hand. Okay, so the solution is not to have every question answered. I'll never get there. Part of the solution is that God reveals himself supernaturally to us. And Jesus looks at Peter and says, "Hey, that was the right answer. But you don't get a big head," right? Because you didn't find the right answer just because you're the smartest of the 12. You found the right answer because my Father has been working to supersede your own intelligence and reveal who I am to you. And I believe that the Father is still doing that today. Whether you've walked with Jesus for 40 years or you are just trying to figure out who Jesus is, the Father is supernaturally revealing who Jesus is to each and every one of us. And then he continues to look at Simon. He says, and I tell you that you are Peter. We'll explain this in a minute. Peter means rock. Okay, rock. It's not a first century name, by the way. You are Peter, and on this rock, okay, remember they're standing against this massive rock, the gates of Hades. On this rock, I will build my church, not Peter's church, but I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. Jesus took them to the very spot where the ancient world believed this is the gate to hell, and makes this declaration. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Then he ordered his disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the third day be raised to life. The minute it comes out that Jesus is making a claim to be God, to be the Messiah, the clock is ticking. People will want to kill him. So that's why he's held this until this moment. Excuse me, as we jump into this, I want to ask a couple of questions, and I've got 2 points that I would like for you to consider. Here's the first question. Of all the places Jesus could have asked the question, why here? What? Okay, so Jesus taking his disciples to Caesarea Philippi, I want to make a modern day equivalent. It would be similar to one of our youth pastors coming and saying, hey, I want to take all of our young men to a missions trip, and we're going to be on the Strip in Las Vegas. And then he asks you to sign a permission slip. And I would go like, buddy, not doing it. Wrong place for a missions trip for teenage men. No, we're not going there. By the way, most of the disciples were, we think, in their teens and early 20s. They're really young men. This is a terrible idea. This is not where Jewish people go. So why does Jesus take his disciples 25 miles farther north than they've ever gone before, and they stand at the base of Mount Hermon, which, by the way, Jewish tradition has all these thoughts. The book of Enoch, which is non-biblical, says that all of the Nephilim, these hybrid beings, gathered together on Mount Hermon to make a plan to destroy humanity. It's the place where over the centuries, how many tens or hundreds of thousands of animals have been sacrificed to these dark beings that lived under the earth, and you coax them into the open. This is a place of paganism. And Jesus takes his disciples to that spot to ask the question, why? Jesus is making a statement. He's making a statement about who he is and what he is here to do. And that statement impacts absolutely everything. Let's talk a little bit about this question, okay? The first question is more general. Jesus asks his disciples, who do people say that the Son of Man is? And what are the answers? Well, the disciples chime in, and they've heard people talking about Jesus. And they say, some say that you're John the Baptist, who had just recently been beheaded, so they must have had some sort of belief that the spirit of John the Baptist had joined Jesus. But John the Baptist was a prophet, a modern day prophet in Jesus' time. Some say you're Elijah. Elijah is an Old Testament prophet you can read about in the Old Testament, very significant. The unique thing about him is he didn't face physical death like every other human. Towards the end of his life, there's this extraordinary moment where there's a chariot of fire and he's taken up into a whirlwind to God. So he doesn't die normally. So the Jewish people had always been believing, they've been under this assumption that Elijah the prophet would come back again. And some say Jeremiah, who's another Old Testament prophet. You can read the book of Jeremiah. He's a very unique individual. He's known as the weeping prophet. He's talking to the people about what will happen, giving them dire warnings, urging them to turn back to God. And then they say, and some people just say, you are one of the prophets. We don't know which one. Here's the common denominator all those answers have in common. You're a prophet. You're a prophet. So Jesus, when people talk about you, here's what they say. You're an extraordinary teacher. You must have a unique relationship with the Father. You hear things we don't hear. You tell us things that God would want to tell us. So you are a prophet. Now, there's about 1.5 billion people on planet Earth that if you ask them, who is Jesus, this would be their answer. You're a prophet. Like we admit you're unique. We admit that you're revered. But if Jesus is just your teacher, your mentor, the person who reveals truth, it's only half an answer. It's not the full answer. Because no prophet should be worshiped. Prophets should be read, prophets should be studied. But here's what Jesus is going to do. It is a matter of weeks before he's making his way to Jerusalem. And he's going to die this death upon a cross and then be resurrected. Here's what Jesus is doing. He's coming to be more than a prophet. Because you don't worship prophets. But 2,000 years later, in a few weeks, all of us, along with like 4 billion other people, are going to gather in churches and celebrate the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, believing he's not just a prophet, he is God himself. Jesus is not just a prophet. So then here comes the next question. The most important question. Who do you, individualized, who do you say that I am? I think Jesus is still asking that question. It's still the most imperative question that you and I will have in our lifetimes. And here's what Peter does. By the way, his name's Simon at this point. Simon just has experienced some sort of revelation from the Father. And he knows that the previous answers that Jesus is a prophet are inadequate. And nobody said this yet. He says, you are the Messiah. Mashiach. Translated into Greek, Christ. Anointed, promised deliverer. And Simon says, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Here's this bombshell statement that Hebrew people had been praying for, a deliverer promised from God since the time of Abraham, going back thousands of years. And Peter says, I'm here in this moment, and I am realizing that you're not just a prophet. I just saw you walk on water in chapter 14, and I bowed and worshiped you, and now here I am standing in this profoundly religious place where people have been worshiping all these gods for all time. And I'm saying, it's not Zeus, it's not Pan, it's not Baal, it's not the emperor, it's you. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus looks at him, makes 2 statements. 1, on this rock, I will build my church. 2nd statement, and the gates of hell will not stand against it. Okay, what's Jesus saying there? So there's a couple of ways that we can understand this. Because right after that, Jesus says, and here, I'm going to give you the keys to the kingdom. So here's a traditional way. I am not, please, as I say this, not disparaging, not trying to knock where you grew up. But there's a large portion of our world, mainly from the Roman Catholic tradition, who view this in one way. And I'm going to say, let's look at it a little bit differently, okay? So in the Roman Catholic tradition, this is the moment of papal inauguration, okay? So they believe, as they read this is the moment where Jesus institutes Peter as the very first pope. on this rock, meaning the person Peter, right? On this rock, I will build my church, and I'm going to give you certain keys. So if this is the case, then the belief has been that papal authority, which includes things like being able to speak ex cathedra, which it means you can speak infallibly on behalf of God. The spirit of Peter is passed on from one pope to another pope throughout the century, and Peter, the pope, is the one who holds the keys to open up doors in heaven and to close doors in heaven, and vice versa on earth. Okay? So that's one way to understand this. And Jesus is building his church upon this papal authority. There's another way to understand it, which I think is taking in mind the context. They're standing at the rock. And they're standing in front of the gates of hell. And as he looks at Peter, he says, okay, Peter, on this statement, that's the rock. The statement that I am the Christ, the Son of the living God. That belief. The church isn't going to be built on a human being. The church isn't going to be built upon an institution. The church of Jesus is built on this idea that Jesus is God. That's the rock. That's the foundation. And if a church begins to build itself on something other than Jesus being the Son of God, you're building on a false foundation. And as he looks at Peter, he says, I'm giving you keys. I'm giving you keys. What are the keys? Well, I would say from context, here's what Jesus is saying to Simon. Simon is going to play this integral role in the first two decades of the early church. In Acts chapter 2, on the day of Pentecost, you've got thousands of what people in Jerusalem and lived in Israel called semi-Jews. They were Jews of the diaspora. So they lived in other parts of the Roman Empire, but they came for the Feast of Pentecost. And they spoke different languages. And Peter's going to stand in front of them. And he's going to make a decision that Jesus is for them. Not just for the traditional Jews that live in the city of Jerusalem. He's going to open up the door and he's going to say, what happened just weeks ago here in Jerusalem is for you. And what's going to happen? 3,000 diaspora Jews, that means the Jews who were spread out across the empire. He's going to put his keys into the gates of hell and unlock it and say, this is for you. Come on out. Acts chapter 10. This same Peter, who has been a really good Jewish boy his whole life, is going to be asked to enter into the home of a non-Jewish person, which was absolutely forbidden. He's praying. He has a vision. In the vision, this very disturbing thing happens, that there's this massive blanket that's let down from heaven, and the blanket opens up, and inside of the blanket are all the animals that Jewish people are forbidden to eat, some of which you love. Shrimp and lobsters and pork. It just goes on and on. And Peter's praying. Here comes the blanket, opens up. And then he hears God's voice say, arise, Peter, kill and eat the shrimp. Peter's like, not a chance. I've never eaten anything that's not kosher my entire life. Happens again. Arise, Peter, kill and eat. And he's just so confused. God is asking me to do something that is clearly stated in the Old Testament. It's not allowed. And then what happens? Knock on the door. Goes downstairs. There's a guy there, and he says, hey, I represent a guy named Cornelius. Cornelius is not a Jew, and he's inviting you to his house. And Peter gets it. Oh, my goodness. God's blowing the doors open. That Jesus isn't just for the Jewish people. Jesus is for the non-Jewish people. And he makes his way to Cornelius' house, and what does he do? He takes out the keys that Jesus has given him, and he puts them into the gates of hell, the gates that have kept people in darkness, in bondage to the other gods. And he opens the door, and he walks in, and he speaks to Cornelius. Cornelius and his entire family believe the message and are baptized. And this is this monumental moment in Acts chapter 10 where the gates of hell, where all new Jewish people, non-Jewish people have been locked away. The gates are open and Peter says, we're coming in, right? We're coming into the Jewish world. We believe that you, as Peter, released something. And it was released in heaven simultaneously. So, please understand this. The most important thing about you is your vision of Jesus. Undoubtedly. The single most important thing that each one of us face is how we're going to answer the question, who is Jesus? Interestingly, I don't have a lot of time to get into this, but do you notice that when Peter declares who Jesus is, right? When Peter declares who Jesus is, do you notice that Jesus declares who Peter is? So his name had been Simon all this time, which was a very popular Simon. I think there's 3 other Simons in the New Testament. Peter says, your given name is Jesus. People in first century Judaism and even in Western culture didn't have last names. You were the son of someone. So I would have been Nathan, the son of Stephen. That's how you would have distinguished me from the other Nathans. And Jesus would have been Yeshua, son of Yosef. Jesus, the son of Joseph. Simon is Simon, the son of Jonah. And now here's what Jesus does. You just said that I am the Christ, the Son of the living God. And when you define who I am, Jesus says, I define who you are. And he says, Peter, you're now Simon the Rock. Peter wasn't a first century name. We use it a lot today, but you'll never find anybody who was named Peter in the first century. It just didn't exist. It'd be like if you named your kid Mountain. Be like, what? Yeah, I know it, you can name your kid Cliff, but or Rocky, but it would be similar to like naming somebody Mountain. You're like, no, you don't do that. And Jesus says, you are Simon the Rock. The Rock. When you decide who Jesus is, Jesus gives you a brand new identity. 2 things I want you to walk away with. When I can answer that Jesus is indeed the Christ, the Son of the living God, 2 things happen in my life. Number 1, you're able to move from fear to faith. From fear to faith. So oftentimes we think that the opposite of faith is doubt. And I would say I don't think that's true. I think the opposite of faith is fear. It's fear. And Jesus has just taken his disciples to this scary place, right? We're like, it's abhorrent in the Jewish mentality what has happened here for centuries. And Jesus stands on the rock, and he stands in front of this terrifying place called the gates of hell. And he says, I want to tell you who I am and what I'm here for. I am here not to hide, not to create some conclave of people who will take my message and hide in the wilderness. I am here to address all of the darkness, to address all of the worship of these fickle gods who you can never please. I am here to put myself face to face against the gates of hell and to conquer death and Hades once and for all. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. And when I become a follower of Jesus, when I say, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God, suddenly I realize I'm not just a part of this, nice little Jesus who, puts a sheep around his neck and walks around and says nice things. Jesus came to conquer death and Hades. Jesus came to destroy the power of sin and darkness in our lives. And he stands in front of the gates of hell and he says, I am here, and on this rock, in this spot, I'm going to build a church. And it's a church that the gates of hell cannot resist. All of a sudden, I'm a part of a new mission. I'm a part of a new assignment. I don't just live trying to earn enough money to retire. I'm a part of a mission where it says, hey, there's the gates of hell. There's somebody there who's locked behind the gates of hell in darkness and fear and addiction. And part of your assignment is Jesus does what? He gives you a set of keys. He says, how about we go and we find the gates of hell and we unlock it and we say, you don't have to be here any longer. We're stepping in. Because Jesus came and conquered this fear and this addiction, this isolation, these worship of these foreign, unknown, violent gods. Jesus came to open up the gates so you no longer have to be in this place. What a mission for your life, right? You have a context of friends and family that no one else in this room has. And when you say you are the Christ, the Son of the living God, Jesus says, you define me, I'm going to redefine you. You have a new mission. And he said, and here's the keys. Here's the keys to everyone you meet. You have the opportunity. I used to read this, and I don't know what happened in my mind. I used to think like the church is behind the gates, and we're like, no, here comes hell. Like, keep them out. Jesus is doing the exact opposite. He's saying, I'm building a church that's so filled with confidence and it's so been transformed that they take the keys that I've given them, they open up the gates of hell and say, Jesus is here. No more need for fear. Here's the second and final thing. When I can say that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, we realize that we are being built and I am being built. So Jesus makes a statement, I will build my church and the gates of hell will not be able to stand against it. So there's two elements to this. One is the church. So Jesus is building a church. This is one of my favorite verses because I have to remind myself of this nearly every week. I don't know why, but sometimes, like weekly, I fail to remember who builds the church. And sometimes I think it's my responsibility to build the church. Guess who is the only one who can build a church? Jesus. The only thing that we can do as humans is we make disciples. We were really clearly told to go and make followers of Jesus. Jesus builds the church. Pressure is off. Individually, part of what this means is Jesus says, I'm going to build the church. And that means he's building you. He's building me. He's taking the fractured, broken parts that he just rescued from the gates of hell. And he's saying, let me begin to restore you, to heal you, to teach you truth, to mature you over a period of time. And so when you are following Jesus, you're part of something that's being made in here, and being made in this room. There's this designer and architect and this miracle maker who is turning us into something that we could never be by ourselves. What would Jesus say to you? When you can say, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Jesus would say, and I tell you, that you are. Put your first name in there. And you're not just who you were. You're also this. And I'm going to hand you keys. And you don't have to be afraid. Go charge the gates of hell. Because I have conquered the power that has been found in the depths of Hades. And I've given the keys to you. Will you pray with me? Lord, the most important question that we will ever need to answer is this: who do you say that I am? Now, I want to make some space right now for anyone who's hearing that question. It's resonating in your mind. You've been struggling with Jesus. You're understanding that you're scrutinizing the teachings of Jesus. You're comparing them. And then we just read that the Father's revealing things to you as well. And if this is the day, the specific day where you would answer the way Peter answered, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. If this is your moment to make that decision, would you just boldly raise your hand and wave at me? Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yeah, I see you. there as well. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Yes. If you're in the balcony, yeah, I see you. Yes, yes, yes. Yeah. And if you're watching or listening, the Lord sees you. Now, let him hand you new keys and let him give you a new identity. And would you walk in faith? And would you join Jesus in the liberation of humanity from what was? In your name, amen. Amen. Hey, would you applaud for a bunch of people that made that decision? Love it. If you need a Bible, they're available at the Welcome Center. They're free. I'd love to get one in your hands if you raise your hand especially. If you need prayer, there's people up front you can trust. They would love to pray for you. And as you go, be the hands, the feet, and mouthpiece of Jesus. Take your keys with you.